The patriotic soldiers came a-marching down the pike, prepared to kill and slaughter in the Colorado strike. With whiskey in their bellies and vengeance in their souls, they prayed that God would help them fill the miners full of holes. In front of these brave soldiers loomed a sight you seldom see. It was a white-haired rebel woman whose age was 83. "Charge!" cried the captain in awful thunder tones, and the patriotic soldiers charged, and they captured Mother Jones. It's great to be a trooper with a musket in your hand, prepared to do the dirty work that the lords of wealth command. It's great to shoot a miner and to hear his dying groans, but none of those deeds compared to that charge that captured Mother Jones. Such is a ditty that tends to go and embody the extreme violence, the extreme upheavals, the extreme repression in Rockefellerado, which was Eugene V. Debs' term for Colorado in the years before World War I. It was a period of massive upheavals where at one time Colorado was the #1 state in the Union in per capita trade union membership, where there was an extremely strong, influential branch of the Socialist Party, where the United Mine Workers conducted extremely violent strikes that culminated on April 20th, 1914 with the Ludlow Massacre. And the Ludlow Massacre, in many ways, is sort of the embodiment of what ruling Colorado was all about and the toils, troubles of the opposition to ruling Colorado. And at an early date, there were strong efforts to especially have unionism among hard rock miners, particularly those digging gold and silver. And often hard rock miners were extremely independent. They were convinced that though they are wage workers today, tomorrow they are going to emerge as mining kings of that, and they wouldn't take any gruff from anybody. And when management tried to fight them, to crush them, they would fight back with a series of upheavals sweeping the state. As opposed to this, the soft rock miners, the coal miners, were often brought into Colorado's as virtual slave laborers from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Mexico, Blacks from the South in the United States, held in isolation of this, denied the opportunity to communicate with the outside world. Time and again, the United Mine Workers, the UMW, is trying to organize Colorado workers and is getting massive repression. And this is the situation where Mother Jones comes to Colorado in 1903. Mother Jones is born Mary Harris. According to her mythological foundation story, she claims to have been born in County Cork about 1830. More likely, she's born about 1848. She grows up in Canada, learns to be a fairly good seamstress along the way. Around the time of the Civil War, shortly thereafter, she marries a guy named Jones, who is an iron muddler in Tennessee. Shortly after the Civil War, a vicious case of yellow fever sweeps Tennessee. It kills her husband and all 4 of her young children. In the wake of this, she relocates to Chicago, where she tries to be a seamstress. No sooner is she seeming to succeed as a seamstress than she is burnt out by the 1871 Chicago fire of this. And before long, she decides she's not going to start again Rather, she's going to adopt the workers of the United States as her boys. And in particular, she throws herself into early efforts of the United Mine Workers. And almost from the beginning, corporate America is engaged in the most vicious union busting against mine worker unions. Something called the Molly Maguires are thoroughly framed by the Pinkerton Detective Agency that lands up going and hanging massive members of the Molly Maguires for more a conspiracy plot that was created by the Pinkertons than anything the Molly Maguires landed up doing. Well, anyway, Mother Jones has this amazing knack for publicity, an amazing ability to ingratiate herself with everyday workers and expose the pompous. And this is the situation when the coal miners go out on strike in Colorado in 1903. And the problem that the union has in building the strike is how to connect the workers with the organizers. Because here you have some guy, he's 25 years old, bold and determined. He goes to this isolated coal mine company town, and he says, I am here to represent the United Mine Workers for America. You know what the goons are going to do with him. So they decide, let's send this 70-year-old woman in there, and Mother Jones starts approaching the coal camps as a poor peddler. She gets past the company goons of this, soon is talking to the miners' wives, before long to the miners' husbands on that itself, organizing the strike of this. And there are two major coal fields in Colorado. Those, the northern fields around Erie, Lafayette, and the southern fields around Walsenburg, Trinidad. And the union is fairly successful in going and winning the strike in northern Colorado, but the crucial field is the southern field around Trinidad, Walsenburg, and there the dominant firm is CF&I, Colorado Fuel and Iron. And during the early 20th century, CF&I is a prized satrapy of the Rockefeller Empire. In fact, while John D. Rockefeller Jr. in particular decides he's going to get rid of most of his corporate directorships, a treasured one that he keeps is that of CF&I. So it's winning the strike in southern Colorado is crucial. And meanwhile, the governor of Colorado at this time, James Peabody, is a coal miner, a banker from Canyon City, and he says, Mother Jones, you are not going to go down to southern Colorado. He puts his spies on her, trailing her all the time, whereupon Mother Jones just disappears one night into a working class district. She goes to the trains. The railroad workers all know her on that. And lo and behold, the next thing you know, she's sending Governor Peabody a telegram. Gee, Governor, guess where I am? I'm down in Trinidad. I'm in Walsenburg of this. So the governor calls out the militia and he tells the militia to arrest Mother Jones and to deport her from Colorado. And sure enough, the militia grabs Mother Jones. And she knows exactly what's going on. She loves being a martyr in this regard. And with the soldiers marching her at the points of bayonet, they put her on a train headed to Kansas. And the captain goes to the conductor and he says, that woman might look like she's a poor, harmless old lady, but don't trust her. Don't let her out of your sight until you have crossed the state line or else on that. And with that, the train all aboard heads to Kansas. No sooner is the train heading to Kansas Then the conductor comes over. Hi, Mother Jones. Of course he knows who he is on that. Is there anything I can do to help you? Well, I don't want you to get into any trouble of this, but could you get me to Denver? And so the next thing you know is all the railroad workers are communicating with each other of that itself. And the next morning, there's Mother Jones at the doors of the Capitol when it opens, and she marches over to Governor Peabody's office, having alerted the press. He hasn't shown up for work yet, and when he does, she has her confrontation. You, Governor Peabody, you don't own the state of Colorado of that itself. And while she gets a lot of publicity, in the end, the Rockefellers are triumphant, and the strike lands up being broken. 10 years later, the United Mine Workers tries again. It massively organizes the workers in both northern and southern Colorado. And as the strike is looming, CF&I and the other coal barons basically tell the union, if you dare have your members strike, we are going to evict you from the company towns, the company stores. You are going to be out in the wilderness. So the UMW, that believes in playing by the capitalist game, goes and leases space from the federal government and buys a bunch of camping equipment. And when about 10,000 workers and their families go out on strike in September 1913 in a blizzard, the Union has prepared about 10 tent colonies near the mines where the workers can try to last out the winter living in tents. The most noted of them is something called Ludlow, which is a railroad crossing about halfway between Trinidad and Walsenburg. And the workers soon settle in there, and before long, the company goons are shooting at them. The workers are shooting back, and the then governor of Colorado, a Democrat, Elias Ammons, sends in the National Guard. And as soon as the National Guard has arrived, it demands disarming the workers. You don't disarm the company goons, the Baldwin-Felt detectives that are in the direct pay of the Rockefellers. You only disarm the workers so the workers can't shoot back of that. And the workers realize what's going to happen if they can't shoot back, so they try to hide their guns, get other guns as necessary. Well, the presence of the militia as a peacekeeping force is temporarily successful in keeping violence under control of that, but before long, the middle-class members of the militia are disgusted. They didn't join the militia to serve as guards and stand around all day in this frigid weather, hoping that nothing is going to happen. And a lot of the National Guard people are officers. In fact, there's about one officer for every 2 enlisted men in the Colorado National Guard at this time. And the members of the National Guard are complaining that why are you wasting us down this strike? And seeing this, Governor Ammons, who sees the extreme cost of paying for the National Guard on active duty, announces that if a member of the National Guard can find a replacement, that member of the National Guard can get out of his duty. And the people that are glad to take positions in the National Guard at this time are members of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. These professional goon strike breakers that now are not only being paid by Rockefeller to break the strike, they also are wearing the uniforms of the Colorado National Guard. And meanwhile, the strike goes on. Conditions are absolutely miserable in the winter of 1913, 1914, among the snowiest, coldest winters ever in the state. that itself, but by April, the workers have still survived out of this. And increasingly, the state of Colorado can't afford the militia, is withdrawing virtually all of the troops, except for a couple of companies filled with members of the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. And the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency is convinced it is going to get rid of those miners at gunpoint as necessary. And this is the situation on Greek Easter, Sunday, April 19th, 1914. And at this time, a lot of the striking workers are Greek immigrants, where the National Guard stages a provocation at Ludlow. And by this time, it has destroyed some of the other tent colonies, or the tent colonies have disappeared, but there's still about 1,000 striking miners and their families at Ludlow. And basically, the National Guard gives an ultimatum to the Ludlow colony that it better produce a non-existent boy by the next morning or else. The next morning, the National Guard deploys. It first begins by killing the leader of the Ludlow colony, Louis Tychus, of that, who of course is conveniently shot while trying to escape of this. It then deploys around Ludlow and starts shooting at the colony. The miners were prepared for this. Being miners, they knew how to dig underground bunkers. And the underground bunkers are where women and children were to go in case of an attack. The men, in turn, head to the hills around Ludlow to try to divert the National Guard, and there was virtually an all-day firefight between the National Guard company goons and the workers around Ludlow. By dusk, the workers are out of ammunition, of that itself on that, realizing that finally the town of Ludlow is helpless. The National Guard lands up, storming it. There, it rips it with machine gun fire. It soaks the tents in kerosene. It sets the tents on fire, and then it shoots at anybody trying to escape from the fire in what is called the Ludlow Massacre. Nobody really knows how many people were actually killed at Ludlow. The official count is in the ruins, in the bunkers, are found the bodies of 2 women and 11 children smothered to death. Probably 40, 50, 60 people were totally killed by the National Guard at that. And the response is massive outrage. And the workers in particular take the initiative. Suddenly, they are starting to storm the mines, destroy the properties of Colorado Fuel and Iron. Faced with a fight, the Baldwin-Felt detectives retreat, disappear. When the governor tries to remobilize the National Guard, numerous members of the National Guard suddenly have commitments in Kansas or Wyoming or family obligations or are sick of that. And for about 10 days, the workers are rampaging through southern Colorado. Conditions are so bad at this is that Governor Ammons has to go to Washington and desperately plea with President Woodrow Wilson to send in federal troops. And Wilson does not want to send federal troops into Colorado because he was then mobilizing the army to try to invade Mexico, to try to defeat the Mexican Revolution. And the US doesn't land up invading Mexico in 1914 because all the available troops have to come to Colorado. Well, when the federal troops arrive, the miners don't want to fight Uncle Sam. They lay down their guns. And for about the next 6 months, the federal troops land up being the peacekeepers, which lands up giving the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron time to regroup and defeat the workers. In the wake of Ludlow, there are massive national protests, there are congressional investigations, and among those that are called in front of Congress are both John D. Rockefeller Sr. and Mother Jones. And amidst all of that, they asked Mother Jones whether she thinks that John D. Rockefeller Sr. was personally really responsible for the Ludlow Massacre. And she says, deep down, I really believe he is a caring, religious individual. He's a victim of the system, that he cannot do it. If he had his choice, he would try to be a humanist. And John D. Rockefeller responds, oh, Mother Jones, you are so nice. You are apt to throw compliments. Whereupon Mother Jones replies, I'm much more apt to throw bricks. Well, anyway, amidst all of these activities, Mother Jones continues to be active in union upheaval strikes into the early 1920s. By that time, members of the United Mine Workers claim she betrays a strike in West Virginia. She's getting old, and supposedly she dies at age 100 in 1930 or so. And by the time she dies, there have been yet more union upheavals in the coal fields. The IWW, the I Won't Work, or the Industrial Workers of the World, organized a major coal strike in 1926, 1927 that culminates in Colorado's first Columbine Massacre, when the state police, at the instruction of Colorado Democratic Governor Billy Adams, shoots down striking workers at the Columbine mine in Weld County in April 1927. Of that. So there's always this kind of activity, upheavals that are occurring in the coal mining community, but the union accepts capitalism. It's essentially a business union dealing with capitalism. The same can't quite be said about the WFM. The WFM is the Western Federation of Miners. And there was a pattern among Western hard rock miners. They would establish themselves in a boom community, get a good wage, working conditions. Management would see this. It would try to bust the union. The workers would fight back. The National Guard would come in and crush the unions and imprison the leadership of the union. In the wake of some bitter strikes in Butte, Montana, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, about 1893, veterans of Western hard rock strikes get together in a prison and there form the Western Federation of Miners. Among the first places where the new Western Federation of Miners tries to assert itself is in Cripple Creek. And Cripple Creek is this instant gold boom community near Pikes Peak that suddenly everybody is going to Cripple Creek in 1893, 1894. And the workers are soon demanding the standard going rate of $3 a day, when unorganized workers are lucky to get $1 a day of this. The mine owners organize to bust the strike. The union fights back, and there is soon severe violence, and the governor naturally sends in the National Guard. However, the governor in this case has second thoughts. The governor is Davis H. White. He is a veteran reformer and the #1 Aspen quack pioneer of being the Aspen Flake of Colorado, who in 1892 is elected as the People's Party candidate, the populist governor of Colorado. And when he sends in the National Guard, he believes it indeed is going to be a neutral force. And as he investigates, he realizes that all the violence down in Cripple Creek stems from the mine owners, not the Western Federation of Miners, and basically he uses the National Guard to support the triumph of the Western Federation of Miners. And with the victory of the Western Federation of Miners in Cripple Creek in 1893, 1894, the Union spreads across Colorado, through the West, into Canada, even lands up going as far east as Alabama for a while. And as the Western Federation of Miners is growing, it is also organizing the towns where places like Cripple Creek, Telluride are soon 100% Union communities. And to make sure this is the case, the Western Federation of Miners, which breaks from the American Federation of Labor in 1896, formed something called the Western Labor Union as a labor federation. And if you are not a miner but want union affiliation, you join the Western Labor Union as an industrial union. It later becomes the American Labor Union. In 1905, it's among the founding groups of the IWW. Well, by the time the IWW is emerging in 1905, the chairman of the founding meeting, who has a big stick in his hand rather than a gavel, is a Denver boy, Big Bill Haywood. And Big Bill Haywood, in many ways, is reflective of the emergence of the Western Federation of Miners and Colorado socialism. He is of an old Mayflower family who grows up in Utah, born about 1878, 1880, maybe a little earlier than that. And as a youth, he's whittling one day, the knife slips, it goes flying into his right eye, it blinds him in his right eye for life. He never gets a patch over the eye and sort of grows up to be this big man, about 5'10", 220, 230 pounds, who looks like he's a cyclops walking around. He tries his hand as a cowboy, at a miner, as a farmer, numerous other trades, and soon has the reputation of being Big Bill. And as Big Bill, of course, the ideal woman for him is a tiny, tiny mate, Nevada Jane miner. And Nevada Jane is maybe 4'8", 4'10", at the most, maybe 85, 90 pounds. She had been thrown from a horse as a girl and never quite recovered from her injuries. But to support her, he goes back into the mines up in Silver City, Idaho in the mid-1890s, and is soon a loyal member of the Western Federation of Miners. He's often seen on Sundays carrying Nevada Jane and their two young daughters in his arm. Nevada Jane is in one arm, the two young girls are in the other arm. He takes her to mud baths that helps her relieve her rheumatoid arthritis of that. And right when Big Bill seems to be this happily married young man, he's injured in a mining accident. Whereupon the Western Federation of Miners says, "You helped us when you were healthy. We're going to help you while you are hurting." And while he is recovering from his injuries, it puts him to work as a bookkeeper. And Big Bill shows himself an excellent bookkeeper, record keeper. He goes around collecting dues on payday. And he is always wearing this big hat of that. And when he goes up to a guy, "Come on, you have to pay your dues," he pulls out of the hat a receipt. He then puts a record in the hat band of who has paid. Big Bill also works as a miner greeting committee member. And in particular, what happens is when a new worker shows up in the gold or silver camps, Big Bill and other members of the union greet the new person, informing him of the advantages of joining the union, that itself, with the implication that if the new person does not want to join the union, there might be a little difficulty along the way. Well, on the basis of being this outstanding organizer, who's a decent writer of this, a good speaker of this, Big Bill Haywood rapidly rises in the union. In about 1901, he is elected secretary-treasurer of the Western Federation of Miners at the same time that the WFM decides it is making Denver its international headquarters. And in the process, Big Bill is the guy that really is running the union, taking care of the paperwork, the manipulations of that itself. He is leading the union in a series of extremely violent upheaval strikes in the gold, silver camps during 1903, 1904, under Governor Peabody. At the same time, Mother Jones is active in the coal workers' strikes. Once more, Governor Peabody calls in the militia. There are agent provocateurs blowing up mines, blaming it on the union. And in the wake of the strikes, there's something of a draw. The Western Federation of Miners is crushed, destroyed in Cripple Creek. It holds on in Telluride and a few other spots around the state. But this is not good enough for the mine owners. And they, by this time, are well organized into their own union, the Mine Owners Association. And they literally want to obliterate Big Bill Haywood. And the opportunity for this soon seems to present itself in late December 1905, when Frank Sternenberg is returning to his house in Caldwell, Idaho. Frank Sternenberg is this no-account politician on the make in Idaho in the early 1890s, doesn't really have much of any profession, any fortune, when he allies himself with the Western Federation of Miners. The union sees that he wins election as governor of Idaho in 1896 and in 1898. No sooner is Sternenberg in office than there is another strike up in the Coeur d'Alenes in northern Idaho, and Governor Sternenberg totally sides with management, calls in the militia, and crushes the union. Suddenly, when he retires from the State House in Idaho, Frank Sternenberg has a very comfortable fortune. Who knows where the money could have come from? Well, anyway, this is the situation as he is approaching his house. He opens the gate and kaboom, he gets blown to bits. The police immediately trace the crime to a disgruntled prospector, Harry Orchard, who claims that Sternenberg had deprived him of a rich mining claim of that. But this is not good enough for the Mine Owners Association. And the Mine Owners Association, working with the state of Idaho, calls in the Pinkerton detectives. And the top Pinkerton operative, James McParland, shares a jail cell with Harry Orchard. He says, "Orchard, you don't want to die, do you? I'll tell you why you killed Orchard. Orchard, you killed Governor Sternenberg because Big Bill Haywood paid you to do that. Isn't that true? In particular, you bought the dynamite from George Pettibone, a blacklisted Union militant from Idaho. And you worked with the president of the Union, Charles Moyer. And on this basis, the Pinkertons draw up an elaborate confession that they attribute to Orchard, blaming Haywood, Union President Charles Moyer, And George Pettibone, who at this time was an appliance dealer in Denver, who worked with the Union all the time of plotting the crime. Well, now that you have a confession like this in hand, if you believe in the legal system of this, you're supposed to take the information to the courts for an extradition hearing. And realizing how dubious the evidence is on all of this, rather the state of Colorado and the city of Denver work with Idaho authorities, the mine owners, and the Pinkertons to kidnap Haywood, Moyer, and Pettibone late on a Saturday night, early Sunday morning in mid-February 1906. They are placed on a special sealed train provided gratis by the Union Pacific Railroad. They are hauled directly to the Idaho State Penitentiary, where they are to be hanged for plotting the assassination of Governor Sternenberg. And when word of this lands up getting out of that, there is immediate outrage of this. There are mass protests. If Haywood, Moyer, and Pettibone die, millions of workers will know the reason why. Eugene V. Debs, who by the way was an old drinking partner of Big Bill Haywood of this, announces that he personally would lead an army of liberation to Idaho to free Haywood, Moyer, and Pettibone if Idaho tried hanging them. And on this basis, the Union appeals to the courts, and the United States Supreme Court eventually says, you're right, that's no way to arrest anybody. That is no way to extradite anybody. But you know what? Big Bill Haywood is such a scoundrel, he deserves to be hanged in Idaho anyway, case dismissed. So the Union then appeals to President Theodore Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt responds, there are certain people in this country like Big Bill Haywood that are undesirable citizens of that. And on this basis, backers of Haywood, Moyer, and Pettibone are soon wearing buttons declaring, I am an undesirable citizen. And the Union hires the top criminal defense attorney in the country, Clarence Darrow, to defend Haywood, Moyer, and Pettibone. And in the course of a 6-week-long trial in the summer of 1907, the entire case lands up being exposed as a frame-up. The jury lands up finding Haywood not guilty. A grand procession accompanies Haywood back to Denver from Idaho. He stops at Union cities along the way. Finally, about 11 p.m. on a Sunday evening, his train pulls into Union Station. And at this time, there was a big metallic arch lit up in electric lights in front of Union Station reading welcome. And as soon as Haywood's train pulls up in Denver, the city orders turning off the welcome arch so Haywood would not be considered welcome back in Denver. Well, there is a second trial where George Pettibone is found not guilty. Charges are dropped against the Charles Moyer then. And by this time, there's extreme tensions between Charles Moyer, who's essentially a bread and butter conservative trade unionist, and Haywood, who is a flaming revolutionary socialist, where Haywood is forced out of office as Secretary Treasurer of the Western Federation of Miners. He goes on to be the top organizer of the IWW for the next decade. Colorado authorities are always trying to pin something on Haywood, including desertion of his wife, a failure to pay her child support, and Big Bill beats those. He shows he is paying child support, other things other than that itself. Meanwhile, when World War I breaks out, the IWW actually has a rather milquetoast position. rather than forthrightly claiming that World War I is this thoroughly imperialist war, that it is necessary that workers do all in their power to turn the imperialist war into a civil war, Haywood is preaching non-opposition, no support, but no opposition. This doesn't matter to the federal government that launches the witch hunt of witch hunts along the way to try to get Big Bill. And in the course of 1917, 18, the federal government rounds up upwards of 100 of the most influential members of the IWW. It frames them in a trial in Chicago. And Bill Haywood, who actually believed in the American legal system, was shocked to find himself found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in Leavenworth. He's out on appeal. The United States Supreme Court refuses to take the case, and he is ordered to surrender to go to prison. Rather than going to prison, he jumps bail. He flees the country. As his ship is sailing out of New York Harbor, he waves to the Statue of Liberty saying, "Farewell, you old hag. You never did anything for me." And the next thing you know is Big Bill Haywood shows up in Moscow, where he's hailed by Lenin and Trotsky as great American proletarian revolutionary leader. When he dies in 1929, he is cremated. Half of his ashes are placed in the Kremlin wall near Lenin's crypt. So there's another Denver boy that made good. Well, by the time that Haywood is being the leader of the IWW, the Socialist Party in Denver is split badly between do-gooders, intellectuals, preachers, reformers, and revolutionary proletarians. And it's not just Denver where the Socialist Party is being ripped apart of this. And in 1912, the conservative leadership of the Socialist Party is very, very fearful of Big Bill Haywood of that, because he's preaching revolutionary socialism, not simply register and vote activities. And on this basis, the conservative leadership, the machine that dominates the Socialist Party, ends up recalling Big Bill Haywood, ousting him from the National Committee of the Socialist Party of that. And soon he is a non-member of the Socialist Party, where the party starts drifting itself on that itself. And by the time new labor upheavals are sweeping Denver in 1920, where there's this massive streetcar strike in the city, you really have temporarily had a slight abatement of the radical movement. The 1920 streetcar strike in Denver, incidentally, in early August, sees corporate goons from San Francisco come into town, guns in hand, shoot down, murder upwards of a dozen workers or so. In this case, federal troops again come in. They bust the strike on that. And that really is something of a terminal point 100 years ago of Denver's early radical history, that has strong foundations, where soon there is an influential Communist Party. The Socialist Party comes and goes. The IWW comes and goes. But those are all other talks, since I was supposed to have been shut up about at least 10 to 15 minutes ago. So with that said,
you still got 10 minutes if you want to take it. I was just pointing out you got 10 minutes left.
Oh, okay, that was sort of all of this in here, unless you want me to get into the Socialist Party and all of its wackos in early Denver.
Well, eventually, probably, but now seems like a natural break. If you're cool with it, we can jump into the discussion portion.